The courthouse was an old brick building that had stood for nearly a century, a reminder of a time when towns like this one were smaller, slower, and bound by community. Its wooden doors creaked as James Miller pushed them open, leaning heavily. On his cane, a cane wasn't for style, it was necessity. His left leg carried shrapnel fragments, the souvenirs of a roadside explosion outside Fallujah that never quite healed. Every step sent a faint ache up his thigh, but James had long learned to walk with pain. Pain, to him, was part of life, just as breathing was. He adjusted his posture, squared his shoulders, and walked toward the courtroom with deliberate dignity. His uniform, though neatly pressed, bore signs of wear. The fabric had softened from years of being tucked away in his closet, yet it still carried the weight of memories that never left him. On his chest, carefully pinned, shone the Bronze Star Medal, a small piece of metal that seemed to light up the dim hallway as sunlight filtered through high windows. As James entered the courtroom, conversations dulled into silence. Heads turned, eyes followed, and a ripple of whispers passed among the benches. Courtrooms were usually filled with chatter about traffic violations, property disputes, or small-town drama, but today the air shifted. People noticed the man, not just the veteran. Some sat straighter in their seats, recognizing the medal instantly. Others, unfamiliar with military honors, only sensed that it carried gravity, something that demanded respect. James ignored the stares. He was used to them. Wearing a uniform in public always drew attention, sometimes admiration, sometimes questions he didn't care to answer. But today, he hadn't come to make a statement. He had come because of a land dispute with his neighbor, a matter he wished could have been settled without lawyers, papers, and judges. Yet here he was, dragged into the machinery of justice. He moved slowly to the defendant's table, lowered himself into the chair, and rested his cane across his lap. The wood tapped lightly against the table, a sound almost lost in the echo of shuffling papers and murmured voices. James folded his hands together, his fingers rough from years of labor after leaving the service. Inwardly, he thought about how strange life could be. He had once stood in deserts, commanding men under fire, making decisions in seconds that meant life or death. And now he was here, waiting to discuss property lines with a judge who had likely never seen the world beyond state borders. Life, he reflected, had a way of humbling everyone. At the back of the courtroom, a small group of veterans had come to support him. They weren't required to be there. James hadn't asked. But when word spread that a decorated veteran was facing a dispute, they came. Old men in faded caps embroidered with unit insignias, younger ones with sleeves rolled up to reveal tattoos of eagles, flags, or dog tags inked forever into their skin. They nodded to James as he glanced back, their silent gesture saying more than words ever could. "We've got your back." Across the aisle sat his neighbor, a man named Donald Hayes, middle-aged, with sharp eyes and a thin mouth set in a permanent frown. Hayes avoided looking at James directly. Instead, he whispered to his attorney, shuffling papers nervously. James knew Hayes disliked him, though he never understood why with any clarity. Maybe it was envy, maybe resentment, maybe the simple friction of two different worlds colliding. What James knew for certain was that their disagreement over a strip of land had grown into something neither man could resolve alone. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the room thickened. People glanced at the medal pinned to James's chest, their eyes drawn back to it again and again. The Bronze Star wasn't the Medal of Honor, but it carried weight. It signified bravery under fire, sacrifice, and commitment beyond duty. For James, it wasn't a piece of jewelry or decoration. It was a reminder of the night his unit was ambushed, of the men who didn't survive, of the silence that followed after the firefight. Every time he touched the medal, he remembered. He could feel the weight of those memories, even now as he sat in the quiet courtroom. His hand brushed against the metal lightly, almost unconsciously, as though grounding himself in the presence of his fallen brothers. He wasn't here to show off. He wore it because it was a part of him, inseparable from who he had become. A cough echoed in the back, followed by the shuffle of boots against the floor. The bailiff, a younger officer with crisp uniform and nervous eyes, stepped forward to announce the arrival of the judge. "All rise," he called, his voice echoing. Everyone stood. James rose carefully, gripping his cane for support. His medal gleamed under the harsh lights of the courtroom as Judge Robert Klein entered, robes flowing, expression stern. The judge carried himself with an air of authority, the kind that came from years of sitting above others, handing down verdicts with finality. His reputation in town was mixed. Some respected his firm hand, others resented his lack of compassion. As Klein took his seat and the room followed, his eyes scanned the courtroom with practiced precision. He barely glanced at Hayes before his gaze landed on James. For a moment, his expression shifted, not with admiration, but with irritation. His eyes lingered on the medal. James noticed. He had seen that look before. Not everyone admired veterans. Some felt uncomfortable, others insecure. A few carried resentment toward reminders of wars they never understood. He braced himself inwardly, though he remained outwardly composed. The judge cleared his throat and shuffled his papers. His tone was sharp, efficient, leaving no room for delay. "We're here for the matter of Miller versus Hayes regarding property boundaries," he began. His eyes flicked up again, narrowing slightly at James's chest. The atmosphere in the room shifted again, subtler this time. A current of unease rippled through the benches. People waited, sensing the judge's disapproval, though no one yet knew what it meant. James straightened in his chair. He had faced worse than this enemy fire, sleepless nights, the sound of explosions rattling through his bones. Whatever happened in this courtroom, he would endure. But something deep in his gut told him that this day, this hearing, would not be about property lines alone. It would become something larger, something symbolic. The quiet hum of the air conditioner filled the silence. A woman in the front row fanned herself with a folded pamphlet. James's cane tapped gently against the floor again, steady and rhythmic, like a distant drum. The courtroom, though still, felt alive with unspoken tension. And as Judge Klein leaned forward, preparing to speak again, James knew instinctively that the medal on his chest was about to become more than a symbol of past battles. It was about to ignite a new one, in the very heart of his own hometown. The gavel cracked once against the wooden block, its sharp report echoing through the hushed courtroom. Judge Robert Klein leaned back in his chair, peering over the rim of his glasses. His reputation was well known across the county. Firm, unbending, a stickler for rules and appearances. He was the kind of judge who believed order in the courtroom reflected order in society. And order, in his mind, meant control. His eyes drifted once more to James Miller, sitting steady in his chair. The cane lay across his lap, his hands folded over it, but it was not the cane that captured Klein's attention. It was the medal. That bronze star, gleaming proudly under the ceiling lights, pinned perfectly over James's heart. The judge frowned. He had seen medals before at parades, at Veterans Day ceremonies, or in neatly framed displays hanging on office walls. But this was his courtroom, a place in his mind that demanded neutrality. He believed in strict dress codes, in removing distractions, in stripping away anything that could sway the perception of jurors or observers. And in his eyes, James's medal was no different than someone wearing a political pin or flashy jewelry. It had to go. He cleared his throat, adjusting his robes. "Mr. Miller," he said, his tone sharp and clipped. James lifted his gaze, his posture respectful, though his jaw tightened slightly. "Yes, Your Honor?" Klein leaned forward, tapping a finger on the desk. "You will remove that medal from your uniform immediately. This is a court of law, not a parade ground." The words landed like a blow in the room. A collective gasp rippled across the benches. The veterans at the back shifted in their seats, eyes narrowing, fists tightening around the edges of their caps. Even those unfamiliar with military honors recognized the harshness of the order. A bailiff, standing near the wall, looked uncertain, his eyes flicking between the judge and James. For a moment, James sat perfectly still. His hand instinctively brushed the medal, as though confirming it was still there. His mind flashed briefly to the desert night when it had been pinned to his chest by a commanding officer. The sound of helicopters roaring overhead, the faces of his comrades illuminated in dim light. He had not asked for recognition. He had not fought for a ribbon, but the medal symbolized something sacred, the lives saved, the courage shown when fear pressed against his heart like a vice. Now here, in this courtroom, it was being treated as a distraction. "Your Honor, James," began, his voice calm even. "With respect, this medal is not an ornament. It is recognition from the United States Army for service rendered in combat. It is a part of my uniform." The judge's face hardened. He didn't appreciate explanations. "I understand what it is," he replied coldly. "But in this courtroom, you will follow the rules. Remove it, or this hearing will not continue." The silence that followed was deafening. A woman in the second row clutched her purse tighter. A man leaned forward, his eyes wide. The veterans at the back exchanged glances, their loyalty to James thickening like an invisible shield. James inhaled deeply, steadying himself. He was no stranger to authority. For years, he had followed orders without question, carried out commands without hesitation, even when they placed him in mortal danger. But there was something different about this command. This wasn't about discipline or strategy. This was about respect for sacrifice, for honor, for lives cut short. He looked the judge squarely in the eye. "I'm afraid I cannot comply, Your Honor." Klein's jaw tightened. His gavel struck the block again, sharper this time. "You will comply, Mr. Miller. This is my courtroom, and you will obey my rules. The medal is irrelevant to these proceedings, and is therefore inappropriate. Remove it now, or I will hold you in contempt." The words hung in the air like smoke after gunfire. The veterans stirred, muttering under their breath. One older man in a faded Marine Corps cap shifted forward as though ready to stand, but a fellow veteran placed a steadying hand on his arm. The tension thickened with every second. James did not flinch. He gripped his cane, feeling the familiar ache in his leg, the reminder of where the medal had truly come from. He thought of the explosion, the heat, the ringing in his ears, the way his hands had trembled as he dragged a wounded soldier to cover. He thought of the men who never returned home, whose families still visited gravestones marked with flags every Memorial Day. To remove the medal now, in compliance with a demand that dismissed its meaning, would feel like betraying them. His silence was his answer. The judge noticed. His eyes narrowed further, his irritation growing. "Mr. Miller, I am giving you a lawful order," Klein marked. "You will not make a spectacle of yourself here. The court is not a place for personal statements." From the back of the room, a voice broke through. "That medal isn't a statement. It's proof he bled for this country." Heads turned. It was one of the veterans, his voice trembling with restrained anger. "Quiet!" The judge thundered, slamming the gavel again. "This is not a public forum. Another outburst, and I will clear the gallery." The veteran sank back, his lips pressed tight, but the damage was done. The atmosphere had shifted further. The courtroom was no longer neutral ground. It was a battleground between authority and honor. James's attorney leaned over, whispering, urgently, "James, just take it off. We can fight the case later. Don't risk contempt." James shook his head slowly, never taking his eyes from the judge. "Not this time," he murmured back. The tension was unbearable. Each second stretched into eternity. The bailiff shifted nervously, unsure whether he would soon be ordered to physically enforce the judge's command. Observers sat frozen, afraid to breathe too loudly. Even Hayes, the neighbor who had brought the property dispute, looked unsettled. He hadn't expected the hearing to take this turn. Judge Klein sat rigidly, his authority challenged in a way he had not experienced before. He prided himself on controlling his courtroom, yet here was a man who would not yield. A disabled veteran, decorated and dignified, refusing to obey. Klein's frustration simmered, his gavel still clutched in his hand. He leaned forward again, his voice low but cutting. "Mr. Miller, this is your final warning. Remove that medal. Now." James's hand rested gently on the medal. His eyes softened, but his resolve remained firm. He thought not of defiance, but of loyalty to the men he served with, to the principles he lived by. He spoke quietly, his words steady enough for the fee. "Whole room to hear. With respect, Your Honor, I cannot. This medal belongs to every soldier who gave their life while I walked away. To take it off would dishonor them." The room held its breath. Even the judge paused, the words striking, deeper than he cared to admit. For the briefest moment, something flickered across Klein's face, not understanding, but uncertainty. The silence grew heavy, like storm clouds before lightning. And though the standoff seemed locked, no one in the room knew the tide was about to shift. For at that very moment, the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung open. A man in full military uniform entered, his presence commanding immediate respect. The 4 stars on his shoulders caught the light, gleaming with authority. Gasps spread through the benches. The veterans straightened instantly. Judge Klein froze, his next. Words caught in his throat. General Mark Thompson had arrived. James Miller's cane pressed firmly against the floor as he rose. His movements were slow but deliberate, every ounce of his body fighting the ache in his leg. The courtroom, still buzzing from the sudden arrival of the general, hushed once. Again, as all eyes returned to James, the Bronze Star Medal gleamed against his chest, catching the overhead lights, its presence now carrying more weight than ever before. His attorney tugged lightly at his sleeve, whispering, "Please, James, don't escalate this. We'll lose the case if you push further." But James wasn't thinking about land boundaries anymore. The property dispute had shrunk into insignificance. What filled his heart now was the sting of insult, not just to himself, but to every man and woman who had worn the uniform, who had given pieces of their lives or their lives entirely, so others could walk freely in this country. Standing straight as his cane allowed, James looked directly at Judge Klein. His voice carried through the room, firm yet calm, each word deliberate. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this medal is not jewelry. It is not an ornament. It is not here to distract or boast. This medal is a piece of my life and the lives of men who never came home. It was awarded to me by my country for actions in combat, and I will not remove it." The courtroom stirred. A murmur of approval rolled through the gallery. The veterans nodded, eyes shining with pride. One of them, a younger man with a prosthetic leg, clenched his fists on his knees, his expression fierce. This wasn't just James's protest anymore. He was speaking for all of them. The judge's face darkened, his authority challenged in front of a packed courtroom. "Mr. Miller," Klein snapped, "this is not about your service. This is about court decorum. I gave you a lawful order. Remove it, or I will find you in contempt." James tightened his grip on the cane. The memories rushed back unbidden. The night in Iraq when his squad was ambushed, the deafening crack of gunfire, the metallic taste of blood in his mouth. He remembered dragging Private Sanchez to safety, hearing the medics shout, feeling the hot blast of shrapnel tear through his leg. He remembered the weight of Corporal Harris in his arms as life slipped away. And he remembered the solemn ceremony weeks later when his commander pinned the Bronze Star to his chest and whispered, "You've carried your brothers home." How could he strip that off now here, simply to appease a judge who saw only decorum? "I have obeyed orders my entire life," James said, his voice steady though his heart pounded. "I obeyed them in deserts, halfway around the world. I obeyed them in firefights when men screamed in my ear and bullets cracked the air. But I will not obey this order. Not here. Not when it asks me to dishonor the memory of the fallen. This medal stays." A sharp intake of breath rippled through the gallery. Hayes, his neighbor and opponent in the case, shifted uncomfortably, clearly realizing he was a witness to something larger than a boundary dispute. Even he, who had never shown James kindness, seemed rattled by the weight of the veteran's words. Judge Klein slammed his gavel, the crack resounding like gunfire in the still room. "Enough," he barked. "You are grandstanding, Mr. Miller. This is my courtroom, and I will not tolerate insubordination." But James didn't sit down. He stood tall, his eyes locked on the judge's. His voice grew louder, not in anger, but in conviction. "This is not grandstanding. This is survival. This medal is not just mine. It belongs to every soldier who didn't live to wear it. It belongs to mothers who buried their sons and daughters. It belongs to families who received folded flags instead of homecomings. If you ask me to remove it, Your Honor, you are not asking me to follow the law. You are asking me to erase them. And I will not." The silence afterward was suffocating. For a long moment, the only sound was the hum of the air conditioner and the faint creak of the judge's chair as he shifted uneasily. His face was flushed now, his stern mask cracking ever so slightly. From the back, the older Marine in the faded cap couldn't hold back. He whispered, loud enough for all to hear, "Damn right." Others nodded, their approval unspoken but visible. A bailiff glanced nervously at the judge, waiting for instructions. If Klein ordered James taken into custody, the bailiff would have to approach a decorated veteran in full uniform in front of a gallery filled with veterans. The thought alone made sweat bead at his brow. James's attorney placed a hand on his client's arm, whispering again, "Please, sit down before this gets worse." James shook his head, his eyes never leaving the judge. "No, this is the hill I stand on." The words hung heavy, resonating through every corner of the room. Judge Klein opened his mouth to respond, his anger battling with something else, something he couldn't quite name. For the first time in years, he felt his authority faltering. He had silenced lawyers, scolded witnesses, even fined citizens for contempt. But this was different. This wasn't disrespect. This was defiance built on something deeper: sacrifice, loss, and honor. Klein's gavel hovered above the block, his hand trembling ever so slightly. He wanted to strike it, to end the debate, to reassert control. But before he could, the tall figure who had just entered, the man in the decorated uniform, stepped fully into the room. General Mark Thompson's boots echoed across the polished floor as he walked toward the front. His presence filled the courtroom like a wave. Every head turned. The veterans in the gallery rose to their feet instinctively, saluting without hesitation. Even those who had never served straightened in their chairs, sensing instinctively the gravity of the moment. James blinked in surprise. He hadn't seen the general in years, not since his discharge. But here he was, as imposing as ever, his chest heavy with ribbons, his face set with the expression of a man who had commanded thousands. The judge froze, his words dying on his lips. The courtroom itself seemed to hold its breath. And James, standing with his medal shining proudly on his chest, suddenly realized that his protest had summoned more than just whispers of support. It had summoned a reckoning one that the judge himself was now powerless to stop. The courtroom stood suspended in silence, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of James Miller's words. He remained standing, his cane firmly pressed into the floor, his bronze star glinting in the fluorescent light. The judge's gavel still hovered above the block, but it did not strike. Authority hung in the balance, challenged not by anger or outburst, but by something far quieter, unyielding resolve. James exhaled slowly and lowered himself back into his chair. The motion was deliberate, not submissive, but steady, like a soldier setting his boots into the earth before a storm. His silence now was louder than any protest he could give. He folded his hands across the cane resting on his lap and fixed his eyes on the bench. The quiet stretched. In that stillness, the weight of his refusal grew. To the casual observer, James had simply chosen to sit. But to those who understood, to the veterans watching from the back row, that simple act was a declaration. I will not bend. I will not erase who I am. His medal gleamed in defiance, a beacon that needed no words. Judge Klein shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He was a man used to obedience, to swift compliance with his orders. Yet here sat a veteran who had faced bullets, bombs, and death, and who now refused to obey a command as small as removing a piece of metal. Klein's jaw tightened, his fingers tapping against the gavel handle. He opened his mouth and closed. It the sharp retort he planned, dissolving into the silence that pressed against him. The bailiff glanced nervously between the judge and James, waiting for direction. But Klein didn't issue the order. Perhaps he sensed what it would unleash. To have the bailiff walk across the room, place a hand on James's shoulder, and forcibly remove the medal, or the man himself, would be to ignite a riot of loyalty from the veterans filling the gallery. Their quiet restraint was fragile, and the judge knew it. James, unmoving, allowed the silence to do his work for him. His protest was not in volume, not in words, but in presence. He remembered the battlefield lesson. Sometimes survival came, not from charging forward, but from holding ground, from refusing to yield even when the odds pressed against you. That was what he was doing now, holding ground. Behind him, the veterans sensed it too. Their breathing slowed, their fists unclenched, and they sat taller in their seats. This was no longer just James's fight. It was theirs. His quiet defiance embodied their own unspoken frustrations, their feeling that the sacrifices they made overseas were often misunderstood, diminished, or forgotten in the places they called home. Hayes, the neighbor sitting across the aisle, shifted uneasily. He had come expecting a straightforward property dispute. Now he found himself in the middle of something far larger than land. He fidgeted with his papers, avoiding James's eyes, wishing the floor might swallow him. For the first time, he looked small, as though realizing his quarrel had been dwarfed by a clash of principles. The courtroom atmosphere thickened, every second of silence amplifying the tension. The judge's robe rustled as Klein leaned back in his chair, clearly unsettled. He stared at James, searching for weakness. But James's stillness radiated strength. His face was calm, his body relaxed, his medal unremoved. Then, with slow deliberation, James placed his hand gently on the medal itself. His fingers brushed over its cool surface, a simple gesture that carried the weight of decades. To him, it was not defiance, but remembrance. To everyone else in that room, it looked like a declaration of loyalty, not to himself, but to those who could no longer stand. The veterans at the back watched, their eyes glistening. They recognized the gesture. Many of them had their own medals tucked away in boxes, hung on walls, or hidden in drawers. Each one carried a story, often painful, rarely told. They knew exactly what it meant for James to keep his pinned firmly to his chest in the face of authority. It wasn't arrogance. It was duty. Judge Klein, frustrated but cautious, leaned forward, his voice lower now, strained. "Mr. Miller, I urge you to reconsider. Your defiance undermines the integrity of these proceedings." James lifted his gaze and met the judge's eyes. He said nothing. The silence after his stare was deafening. A younger clerk seated near. The bench shifted in her chair, visibly moved, though she tried to mask it. The bailiff avoided James's eyes altogether, his face pale. Even the general, who had been standing quietly near the doorway since his arrival, crossed his arms and watched, the faintest flicker of approval passing across his stern features. James's defiance was not the defiance of a rebel, but of a soldier who had learned long ago that some things could not be surrendered. He had surrendered enough already, his health, his sleep, his brothers in arms. This medal was not negotiable. The minutes dragged on, but James remained still. The judge's gavel lay untouched. The audience leaned forward, sensing history in the making. No one dared break the spell. At last, the general stepped forward, his boots striking the floor like drumbeats. The sound cut through the tension and drew every eye. He stopped beside James, standing tall, his chest covered in ribbons that told stories of decades of service. He didn't speak yet, but his presence alone added gravity to James's silence. The judge froze, caught in the sight of not just one, but two unmovable figures. The quiet defiance of a decorated veteran and the looming authority of a four-star general. Klein's authority, once absolute in this room, now hung by a thread. And still, James remained unmoving, his medal shining. It was not anger that filled the room, nor chaos, but something far more dangerous to the judge's authority. Respect. Respect not demanded, but commanded by presence alone. That was James Miller's quiet defiance. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom had swung open just minutes before, but the effect still lingered in the air like the aftershock of an explosion. People who had been leaning forward in their seats froze mid-motion. Conversations that might have begun died instantly. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed suddenly too loud, as though the building itself recognized the weight of the man who had walked in. General Mark Thompson did not need to announce himself. His uniform did it for him. The 4 silver stars stitched on his epaulets caught the light, and the rows of ribbons and decorations on his chest testified to decades of command and sacrifice. His boots struck the floor with a rhythm that echoed authority. He moved with a confidence that came not from arrogance, but from the kind of experience few men could ever claim. This was a soldier who had commanded thousands, a leader whose decisions had altered the course of battles. The gallery of veterans rose to their feet almost instinctively. It was not out of habit, but out of respect. Old knees groaned, stiff. Backs straightened, caps were removed, and in the silence of the moment, the room became something other than a courtroom. It became sacred ground. Judge Klein, still seated on the bench, stiffened visibly. His hand, which had hovered above the gavel only moments earlier, lowered slowly. His face flushed, though whether with anger, surprise, or embarrassment was unclear. The courtroom was his domain, his kingdom of law and order, but the presence of General Thompson shifted the balance of power in ways he could not control. James Miller, seated with his cane resting across his knees, looked up and blinked in disbelief. He had not seen the general since his discharge years ago. The last time had been at a military hospital, where the general had walked the halls to speak with wounded soldiers. James remembered the man's words, even then encouraging. Steady, carrying the weight of someone who understood loss. And now, here he was, striding into a small-town courtroom like a thunderbolt. The general's eyes swept the room once, assessing it as though it were a battlefield. His gaze lingered on the judge for a moment, then shifted to James. Without hesitation, he walked down the aisle, the sound of his boots striking like a drumbeat of inevitability. When he reached James's table, he stopped and placed a firm hand on the veteran's shoulder. The gesture was simple, but it carried volumes. To James, it felt like the weight of every comrade, every commander, every brother in arms had just walked in to stand beside him. The gallery collectively exhaled, as though they had been holding their breath. Some veterans raised their hands in salute. Others nodded firmly, their expressions hard with pride. Judge Klein cleared his throat, forcing his voice steady. "General Thompson," he said, the name carrying reluctance on his tongue. "This is highly irregular. This courtroom is not open to interruptions." The general's head turned slowly toward the bench. His voice, when it came, was low but resonant, carrying across the room without effort. "Irregular? No, Judge. What's irregular is asking a decorated veteran to strip his uniform of the honors his country placed upon him." The words hit the courtroom like a hammer. Even those unfamiliar with military traditions understood the rebuke. Klein's face tightened. He adjusted his glasses, a small act that betrayed his unease. This is not about honors. It is about maintaining the integrity of the court. Symbols, no matter their origin, can create bias. The general's eyes narrowed slightly. Bias? He gestured toward James, his hand firm on the veteran's shoulder. That medal is not a campaign sticker. It is not jewelry. It is not a symbol of vanity. It is recognition of courage under fire. You sit here because men like him bled to protect the very laws you now claim to uphold. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, the tension boiling over. Veterans nodded vigorously, while civilians whispered in awe. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure whose authority to follow in that moment. James, still seated, felt the weight of the general's words settle into his bones. He had spoken his own protest, but hearing it amplified by a leader. Like Thompson transformed it into something larger than himself. It was no longer just about a medal. It was about the principle of respect owed to all who had served. Klein's lips pressed thin. He reached for his gavel again, but his hand trembled slightly. The authority he wielded so easily moments ago seemed to slip through his fingers like sand. The general continued, his voice unwavering. "I walked into this room because I heard what was happening here today. I could not stand by while a man who carried brothers off the battlefield is told his service is a distraction. That is not law, Judge. That is arrogance." The last word landed heavy. The judge flinched, his eyes darting briefly toward the gallery as though seeking support, but he found none. The people were with James now. The courtroom, his domain, was no longer his. James shifted slightly, his hand brushing the metal again. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The general's presence spoke for him. His quiet defiance had summoned something larger than he ever expected. The tension thickened. For a moment, it seemed the air itself held weight, pressing against every chest in the room. Would the judge double down? Would he risk ordering the bailiff to enforce his command in front of a decorated general and a room filled with veterans? Klein swallowed hard, his face pale now. His voice, when it returned, was thinner. "This is still my courtroom," he said weakly, "and I will be respected." The general's reply was immediate. "Respect is earned, Judge, not demanded." And this man, he tightened his grip on James's shoulder, earned more respect on a battlefield than most will in a lifetime. Do not mistake your authority for superiority. The words cut like a blade, leaving no room for argument. The silence that followed was different from before. It was no longer thick with tension, but heavy with the undeniable truth of what had been said. Everyone knew it, even the judge. James felt a strange peace wash over him. He hadn't asked for the general to come. He hadn't expected it. But in that moment, he understood something. He had never truly been alone in this fight. His brothers, his fellow veterans, his leaders, they were always with him, even here, in a courtroom far from the battlefield. The general straightened, his eyes still fixed on the judge. The room waited, breathless, for what would come next. And in that moment, everyone knew the balance of power had shifted for good. The silence that lingered in the courtroom was no ordinary silence. It was the kind of silence that clung to skin and filled lungs, heavy and suffocating, yet impossible to break. Every eye was fixed on the man who now commanded the room, not Judge Robert Klein in his robe and elevated seat, but General Mark Thompson, standing tall and immovable beside James Miller. For a moment, the general said nothing. He simply scanned the room, his sharp gaze moving from the veterans in the gallery to the attorneys shifting uneasily at their tables, then finally landing on the judge. His stillness spoke louder than words. He was measuring the space, assessing the battlefield, just as he had done countless times in war zones. When he finally spoke, his voice carried not just authority, but conviction. This courtroom belongs to the law, Judge, but the law itself rests on a foundation built by sacrifice. Without that sacrifice, this building, these proceedings, even your robe, none of it would exist. Do you understand that? Judge Klein's jaw tightened. He gripped the edges of his bench, as though bracing himself against an unseen force. General Thompson, he replied, his voice sharper than before, though still betraying a crack. I respect the military and its role, but this is a courtroom, not a parade ground. We cannot allow personal symbols to influence justice. The general's eyes narrowed slightly, and he stepped forward, boots echoing on the polished floor. Personal symbols? That medal is not personal in the way you imply. It is not a trinket he bought, nor a vanity he chose to wear. It is recognition given by the United States of America for valor in combat. Do you know what that means, Judge? Do you understand the cost attached to that piece of metal? His voice rose slightly, not in anger but in weight, filling the room with something larger than sound. The veterans in the gallery leaned forward, their faces hard, their eyes burning, with recognition of the truth being spoken aloud. Civilians who had come expecting a dull property hearing now sat spellbound, realizing they were witnessing something historic. The judge's gavel tapped nervously against the block, a hollow sound in comparison to the general's booming presence. This is not about cost, Klein insisted, though his tone lacked conviction. This is about impartiality. Every courtroom must remain free from undue influence. The general let out a quiet, humorless laugh. Impartiality? He turned slightly, his gaze sweeping across the gallery. Let me ask you this, Judge. If a man walked in here wearing a wedding ring, would you demand he remove it for fear it might bias the court? If someone wore a cross around their neck, or a Star of David, would you strip them of it? Would you tell a police officer testifying to remove his badge because it represents authority? The questions cut through the room like a blade. Number. One dared answer, but the truth was clear. The double standard had been exposed. James sat still, his hands folded atop his cane, but inside his chest a warmth spread. The general was not only defending him, he was defending every man and woman who had ever returned from battle to find their sacrifices misunderstood or minimized. The general took another step forward, his towering frame closing the distance to the bench. This medal is not vanity. It is memory. It is pain. It is blood spilled and lives lost. When you tell this man to remove it, you are not asking him. to take off a pin. You are asking him to erase his brothers who never came home. You are asking him to dishonor the very system of freedom you claim to protect in this courtroom. Gasps rose from the gallery, soft but audible. A woman in the back wiped her eyes with a tissue. A veteran near the aisle nodded fiercely, his hand gripping the brim of his cap. Even the bailiff, caught between two forms of authority, swallowed hard, clearly moved by the general's words. Judge Klein shifted in his seat, visibly rattled. His robe, once a shield of power, now looked like fabric draped over a man exposed. His authority, so absolute at the beginning of the hearing, seemed to drain with every word the general spoke. The general's voice dropped lower, more solemn now. I've commanded men like James Miller. I've looked them in the eye before sending them into battles where I knew some would not return. I've written letters to their families. I've stood by graves and saluted the flag as it was folded. That medal you want stripped from his chest is not just his. It belongs to every man who fell beside him, every man who breathed his last. While he lived on, you dishonor them when you call it a distraction. The silence that followed was unbearable, thick with emotion. Even Judge Klein looked momentarily speechless, his mouth opening and closing without words. His hand rested uselessly on the gavel, as though he no longer knew what authority it truly carried. James felt his throat tighten. He remembered faces his closest friends from Iraq, the sound of their laughter, the weight of carrying their bodies to safety, the silence of watching them lowered into the earth. His eyes burned, but he blinked back the tears. He could not cry here. Not now. But the general's words pierced straight into the raw part of his soul, where those memories lived. The general turned slightly, addressing the room as a whole now. You all sit here today because men like James wore that uniform. Don't ever forget that. That medal is not a distraction. It is a reminder. And perhaps this courtroom needs reminding. Applause broke out from the gallery, restrained at first, and swelling despite the usual rules against such displays. Veterans clapped slowly but firmly, their hands echoing with the rhythm of solidarity. Even some civilians joined in, overwhelmed by the gravity of the moment. Judge Klein pounded his gavel at last, the sound sharp, desperate. Order! I will have order. But it was too late. The authority had shifted. The people were not looking at him anymore. Their eyes were fixed on the general and the quiet veteran seated at his side. The applause subsided into silence once more, but it was a different silence than before. This one carried respect. It carried acknowledgement. It carried the unspoken truth that something fundamental had changed in that room. General Thompson, satisfied, turned his gaze back to the judge. So, Judge Klein, will you still demand that this man remove his medal? Will you still insist that honor itself is unwelcome in your court? The question hung in the air, unanswerable in any way. That would preserve the judge's dignity. Klein's lips parted, but no words came. His hands trembled slightly as he set the gavel down. James, sitting silently, knew the tide had turned. The battle was no longer his alone. The general had spoken, and his words would not be forgotten. The courtroom sat suspended, awaiting the judge's response, but everyone already knew the outcome. Honor had reclaimed its place. The gavel lay motionless on the bench, abandoned like a weapon dropped in surrender. Judge Robert Klein stared down at the scene before him, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. He had spent decades building his reputation as a man of strict order, a judge whose commands were never questioned. Yet here he sat, exposed, his authority dismantled piece by the presence of one silent veteran and the commanding voice of a general. For the first time in his career, Klein felt the room slipping entirely from his grasp. It wasn't just the gallery of veterans who defied him, it was the very air of the courtroom. Respect, once automatically granted to his robe and gavel, now flowed toward the two men at the defense table. Every eye in the room reflected it, and none of it belonged to him. He shifted uncomfortably, tugging at the sleeves of his robe, as though straightening the fabric could restore the dignity. It had lost, but the robe no longer held power. It was simply cloth draped over a man who had made a mistake. Klein's mind raced. He replayed the moments leading up to this humiliation, a command to remove the medal, the veteran's quiet refusal, the suffocating silence, and finally the general's arrival like a thunderclap. Each choice he had made had seemed reasonable. In the moment, consistent with the rigid rules he prided himself on enforcing. But now, in hindsight, he saw the cracks. His insistence had not been about law. It had been about control. He had treated the medal as though it were a simple ornament, something to be stripped away in service of courtroom decorum. But now, with the general's words still reverberating in his ears, he understood his error. A medal was no mere symbol. It was a lifeline, tethered to the memory of lives lost and battles fought. Demanding its removal had not only insulted James Miller, it had desecrated the sacrifices of all who had served. And the people in the room knew it. That was the worst part. Klein glanced at the gallery. Veterans sat with their eyes locked on him, their faces lined with disappointment, pride, and simmering anger. Their silence weighed heavier than their applause had moments earlier. He could feel it pressing down on him, demanding not just acknowledgement, but contrition. His throat tightened. Judges did not apologize. Judges commanded, corrected, overruled. Yet here he was, confronted with the undeniable truth that his authority had shriveled before the collective weight of honor. General Thompson still stood, beside James, his hand steady on the veteran's shoulder. His posture was relaxed, yet his presence radiated unshakable authority. Klein found himself avoiding the general's gaze, as though the man could see through the black robe, through the polished veneer of power, into the smallness that lay beneath. For a fleeting moment, Klein felt resentment. This was his courtroom, his kingdom. He had spent years cultivating the aura of command here. And now, in less than an hour, a soldier and his medal had dismantled it all. But resentment could not survive against the truth, knowing it his conscience. The general's words echoed in his mind. Respect is earned, not demanded. He remembered his father, a man who had served briefly during Vietnam, who had worn his own service with quiet dignity. Klein had grown up with stories of men who came home broken, men who were never thanked properly for what they endured. He had admired his father for surviving it. Yet somehow, in the blind pursuit of order, he had forgotten that admiration. His gaze drifted back to James. The veteran sat silently, cane across his knees, the bronze star pinned firmly to his chest. He had said little, yet his stillness had shouted louder than any lawyer's argument ever could. Klein saw it now, saw the strength in the quiet defiance, the integrity in his refusal to strip himself of honor. The judge's heart pounded, each beat a reminder of the choice before him. He could dig deeper into his pride, issue an order, and risk an open revolt in his courtroom. Or he could do what he had never done before, admit he was wrong. The decision stretched out in painful silence. The courtroom waited, hanging on his next words. At last, Klein leaned forward, his hands clasping the edge of the bench. His voice, when it came, was quieter than usual, stripped of its usual steel. "Mr. Miller," he began, the words heavy on his tongue, "I may have overstepped." The room stirred. Whispers rippled across the gallery. Some leaned forward, scarcely believing what they had just heard. Klein swallowed hard, forcing himself to continue. "It was not my intention to diminish your service, or the meaning of the medal you wear. In my desire to maintain decorum, I forgot the greater principle at stake." He paused, the silence aching. "For that, I acknowledge my error." The words were awkward, halting, but genuine. And in that moment, the judge's pride cracked open, revealing the man beneath the robe, fallible, flawed, but human. James lifted his eyes, meeting the judge's gaze. He did not smile, nor nod, nor speak. He simply looked at him, his expression calm, his presence unyielding. It was not forgiveness yet, but it was acknowledgment, and that was enough. General Thompson inclined his head slightly, the faintest sign of approval. His hand remained on James's shoulder, grounding the veteran. In the moment, the gallery softened. Veterans exchanged looks of quiet satisfaction. Civilians nodded, sensing the weight of what had just unfolded. Klein exhaled, a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He had not lost all authority. By admitting his mistake, he had reclaimed a fragment of it, not through command, but through humility. The hearing would continue, yes, but nothing would ever be the same in that courtroom. The lesson had been carved deep into its walls. Authority without respect is hollow, but respect rooted in sacrifice can never be stripped away. And as Klein adjusted his papers and tried to steady his hands, he knew that this day would haunt him for the rest of his career, not as a moment of shame, but as a moment of reckoning. For in the presence of quiet defiance and a general's voice, he had realized the limits of his power. And in that realization, he had been humbled. The courtroom, once a chamber of tension and confrontation, had shifted subtly in its atmosphere. Judge Klein, seated behind the bench, had finally spoken words that no one thought he would, words of acknowledgement, of humility. The gavel lay dormant, a symbol of authority tempered by conscience. For the first time, the courtroom felt less like a stage of power and more like a place where truth and honor could breathe. James Miller remained seated, his bronze star medal gleaming in the subdued light. He adjusted the cane resting across his knees, careful not to draw attention from its weight, from the reminders of battles long past. The ache in his leg was still there, a constant companion, but the discomfort of the last tense hour had shifted to a quiet satisfaction. His defiance had been acknowledged, not punished. And that, for a man who had known war, was a rare and precious victory. General Mark Thompson stood beside him, still imposing, but softened by a subtle warmth in his expression. His hand rested briefly on James's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that needed no words. The general had not come to lecture, nor to intimidate. He had come to remind everyone in that room, from judge to civilian, from witness to veteran, what sacrifice and honor truly meant. And in that reminder, he had succeeded. Klein cleared his throat, the sound shaky, breaking the charged silence. "Let the record show," he began, his voice more steady now, "that in recognizing the service and sacrifice of Mr. James Miller, this court acknowledges that acts of valor and dedication cannot and should not be diminished by protocol. Alone, any previous instructions regarding his uniform or medals are hereby rescinded." A murmur swept through the courtroom, a mixture of relief, admiration, and quiet triumph. The veterans exchanged glances, some clapping softly, careful not to break decorum, while others simply nodded, satisfied that justice and respect had finally aligned. James allowed himself a small exhale, a weight lifting from his shoulders. The tension that had coiled inside him all morning began to unwind. He looked at the medal, still pinned firmly above his heart, and for a fleeting moment, he allowed himself to remember the faces of those he had carried, the men who had never returned home, and the friends who had fought beside him. This moment, too, was theirs. The recognition he had fought to maintain in the courtroom extended beyond the walls. It was a tribute to every soldier who had faced danger with courage and had returned carrying invisible scars. The general's voice cut through the soft whispers. "Mr. Miller," he said, his tone respectful but firm, "your conduct today exemplifies the principles we train for, but often never get to demonstrate. Courage isn't only on the battlefield. It's here, in standing by your convictions when others demand compromise. You've upheld honor today, not just for yourself, but for every soldier who knows the cost of service. James nodded, the words resonating deep within him. He had spent years in the military learning obedience, discipline, and strategy. But this moment of standing unwavering in his own truth felt more like the battlefield than any he had ever faced overseas. And yet, unlike the firefights of Iraq, he had not fought alone. The gallery erupted in quiet applause, restrained, yet meaningful. Veterans and civilians alike acknowledged the rare spectacle they had witnessed. A man standing firmly by his principles, validated by the presence and voice of someone who had commanded and understood the harshest realities of war. Even Donald Hayes, the neighbor whose property dispute had sparked this ordeal, looked on with a mixture of confusion and awe. He had arrived expecting a mundane court proceeding, a routine hearing over boundary lines. Instead, he had become an observer to something far greater. He had watched respect earned, authority humbled, and a community witness honor defended in its purest form. Hayes's eyes flicked nervously toward Klein, perhaps realizing that a simple property dispute had become a lesson in humility and morality. Klein, seated behind his bench, straightened his robes and cleared his throat. Though the embarrassment lingered, he had regained some semblance of composure. He addressed the room carefully, his words deliberate. The court will now proceed with the matter at hand, though it is clear that today's events have reminded us all that law and justice are inseparable from human experience and the sacrifices made to protect it. James's attorney gave him a subtle nod, and James leaned back slightly, still gripping his cane, but now with a sense of quiet victory. He had not raised his voice, nor had he demanded special treatment. He had simply remained steadfast, guided by principle, and bolstered by those who understood sacrifice. The rest of the hearing proceeded with procedural motions, discussions about property boundaries, and legal arguments. Yet the room's tension had dissipated, replaced by a shared understanding that no medal, no honor, and no person could be dismissed lightly. Even Klein, who had begun the day with rigid control, seemed tempered by the experience, weighing his rulings with a newfound perspective. After the court formally adjourned, James stood slowly, adjusting his cane. General Thompson placed a hand on his shoulder once more. "You handled that with dignity, James. Remember, true courage is often quiet. Today, the world got to see a glimpse of it." James nodded, gratitude and relief mixing in his expression. He had faced danger in deserts far away. He had carried the wounded under fire, and he had stared death in the face. But today, in a small-town courtroom thousands of miles from war, he had faced a different kind of challenge, one that required moral courage, patience, and quiet resolve. And he had prevailed. As he exited the courtroom, James could hear the murmurs of respect behind him, not just from the veterans, but from civilians who had witnessed the unfolding events. Some offered nods of acknowledgement. Others whispered in admiration. Even Donald Hayes followed at a distance, silently processing the weight of what had transpired. Outside, the sunlight was gentle, casting long shadows across the courthouse. Steps. James paused and lifted his gaze to the sky, feeling the warmth of the day on his face. The metal caught the sunlight, gleaming brilliantly, a symbol not of vanity, but of honor, endurance, and sacrifice. For James, it was more than recognition. It was a reaffirmation of the principles he had lived by, tested not on the battlefield, but within the walls of a courtroom. And it was proof that courage, whether in war or in the quiet defiance of injustice, never went unnoticed. General Thompson stood beside him, saluting briefly before offering a simple, firm handshake. Well done, soldier. James clasped the general's hand with respect and gratitude. Thank you, sir, he replied simply. The crowd began to disperse, but the story of that day would linger far longer than anyone anticipated. It would be remembered not for legal proceedings, nor for property disputes, but for the unwavering courage of a disabled veteran, the humility of a judge forced to reconsider, and the presence of a general who reminded everyone what honor truly meant. James turned toward the courthouse steps, feeling lighter, freer. He knew the road ahead would still be filled with challenges. Life always was, but this day it reaffirmed something essential. That integrity, courage, and honor could not be stripped away by rules, protocol, or intimidation. They were and always would be immutable. And for James Miller, the Bronze Star gleamed brighter than ever, not just for him, but for the men and women who had given their all, and for the truth that some battles, though fought far from the battlefield, were equally worth winning. The courthouse doors closed behind him, the echoes of history lingering, a quiet testament to a man who refused to compromise his honor, and to a world reminded that true courage, when recognized, could move even the most unyielding hearts.